I'm pleased to introduce Professor Chiara Formichi, who studied Islamic studies and the history of Islam in Indonesia at the University of Rome and earned her PhD in history from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Professional positions include a postdoctoral fellowship in Singapore at the Asia Research Institute and a research fellowship at the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies in Leiden, before she served as assistant professor of Asian and International Studies and associate director of the Southeast Asia Research Center, City University of Hong Kong. She joined Cornell's Department of Asian Studies last year and teaches courses on aspects of religion in Asia with a focus on Islam and Southeast Asia. Her publications include the monograph Islam and the Making of the Nation, Kartosuwiryo and Political Islam in 20th Century Indonesia, 2012, Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies. The edited volumes Religious Pluralism, State and Society in Asia, 2013, Routledge, and Shi'ism in South Asia, 2014, Hurst Company with Michael Feener, as well as articles in journals such as Indonesia Journal, Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, and Die Welt des Islams. Today, Professor Formichi will discuss her new book, Shi'ism in Southeast Asia, Alid Piety and Sectarian Constructions, just published by Oxford University Press and scheduled for release momentarily. Professor Formichi co-edited this volume with Michael Feener of the National University of Singapore, and together they offer what, according to the publisher, promises to be the first book in any language to engage critically with the traditions of Alid Piety so that we can shift academic discourse away from the polemical sectarian discourses on so-called Shi'ism in Southeast Asia. The contributors consider previously unpublished early manuscript sources in Southeast Asian Muslim vernacular literatures, as well as varied ethnographic material from across the region. This new study considers a range of cultural traditions and ways in which Alid Piety has been transformed since 1979 and the Iranian Revolution. Please join me in welcoming Professor Formichi.
Thank you for the extremely generous introduction and for having me, and thank you for coming on a Wednesday afternoon at 4:30. I think everybody's coming out from class, so I appreciate that. Thank you. What I'm going to do today is run you a little bit through the genesis of this book, of how we came about putting it together, and we were reflecting on two parts of the title. One part being Shi'ism, which is something you might be more familiar with, and Alid Piety, which might be something that you're way less familiar with, and trying to understand what are the differences there and why we think it's an interesting way to look at devotion within a portion of the Muslim population in Southeast Asia, but hopefully also more broadly than that. First things first, who are the Shiites? Who is a Shia? I only have 2 slides, this and a map of Southeast Asia. So who are the Shia? So Shi'ism is usually understood as a sub-branch of Islam on a par with Sunni Islam. Other branches that we can think of along the same side would be Sufi Islam, even though it's, if we were to draw a diagram, you'd have one circle which is Sunni Islam, one diagram that is Shia Islam, and another circle that is both self-standing and overlapping with either Sunni or Shia Islam, which is Sufi Islam. Shia Islam is by and large a minority religion across the world. The only Shia majority countries are Iran, most famously, Azerbaijan, less famously, Iraq, and Bahrain. Maybe you have heard about the Bahrain Revolution of a couple of years ago, the Bahrain Spring. It is a Shia majority country ruled by a Sunni monarchy, and it has been as such for decades. Within this, so the Shias comprise between 13 and 20% of the Muslim population across the world, and it's a very big variation between 13 and 20%. And that's because most Sunni majority countries tend to undercount their Shia populations. Is a big problem. is partly because of census classifications, but often is a deliberate political position that governments take. Now, what about Southeast Asia? Numbers are extremely tiny. There are actually non-numbers because within Southeast Asia, when we do have data, is usually Muslims versus Buddhists, Christians, Hindus, Confucians, and so on and so forth. Just to give you an example, the country that I'm most familiar with is Indonesia. And in Indonesia, the numbers range between 500,000 and 2.5 million Shia. And this really depends on who you ask. Even if I like to take a middle ground position, so let's think about maybe 2 million people, is still 1% of the population of Indonesia. A very tiny minority, but it's the same proportion as Muslims in America. I often think that this puts things into perspective. But the real question is how not just are Shia Muslims counted, but how do we count someone as Shia? We have one way of understanding this, which is a programmatic approach to say Shia is a Muslim who follows the school of law of Shia Islam, which would be the Jafari law. I'll try and throw as few Arabic words as possible, I promise. But we can also take, and this is what we try to do, you can take a way broader approach to who is a Shia, which is anyone who actually performs acts of devotion towards people who are important to the Shiites, but are also important to the Sunnis. So if we were to go back to those two diagrams, actually you would have circles in which you have the Sunnis and the Shiites, and they overlap somewhere. So Shi'ism is really usually defined as a branch of Islam that emerged in the late 7th century when the Muslim community could not agree on who should succeed to the Prophet Muhammad. This is correct. Let's say within no less than 150 years, we start having Shi'ism emerging as a school of legal thought. Up to then, there was what Marshall Hodgson defined as a pre-sectarian identity and a pre-sectarian devotional practices, which he defines as Alid Piety. So the term that Michael Feener and I and the contributors to the volume are taking is really a term that emerged from pre-9th century Middle East. And we are taking that and parachuting it, let's say, 1,000 years later, thousands of miles away into Southeast Asia, to try and understand how Sunnis and Shiites might actually be interacting within the same devotional space. So we're taking the law out, we're taking the politics out, and really trying to reflect on one of the cores of religious practice, which is devotional practices and rituals. We were rather blessed, in a way. When I started this project as part of my postdoctoral fellowship in 2009, I was just thrown into this. I was doing still my PhD research, and I walk into a house for an interview, and I see a picture on the wall of Imam Hussein by his horse. It's a picture that you would often see in Shia houses, and I was in West Java, which is here, near Bandung. And I elbowed my assistant, and I said, what's going on here? I thought this was a Sunni house. I was doing research on idea and practice of an Islamic state in Java, and I never heard anything about Shia Islam being present there. And my assistant got extremely upset and offended, said, of course this is a Sunni house. These are my in-laws. I said, well, but, do you see the picture there on the wall? That's Imam Hussein. Said, oh, but this is West Java, of course. So, okay, I come from a background in Islamic studies, and I never heard anything like that. So I said, okay, I'll take this piece of information and put it on the side of my brain, and I deal with my PhD dissertation first, and then I can get back to that. So it's in this milieu in which I was in West Java, and then later I moved to East Java, to Yogyakarta, and I started hanging out with Shiites, and they were pretty cool university kids going to a philosophy center where they used to read Shia Iranian philosophy but they were not participating into any of the devotional practices that I would usually have understood as being classifying someone as a Shiite. And so my rather dichotomous view of who's a Sunni and who's a Shiite was being deeply undermined at the core. So I thought that would make an interesting project. Fortunately, my mentor was all for it, and we had the fortune to organize a workshop and have extremely interesting colleagues to come and contribute their vision to this gray area that is not Shia Islam, is not Sunni Islam. We took a very historical perspective, but also could not deny contemporary developments. The title here is germane to this discussion, so it's Alid Piety and Sectarian Constructions. Much of the debate or the discourse on Shia Islam or Sunni Shia Islam rests on sectarian conflict or sectarian identities. What I had initially experienced in Indonesia was a non-sectarian encounter. Between 2009 and 2015, if you wish, things have dramatically changed. Just last week was Muharram, was the apex of Muharram. So Muharram is the first month of the Muslim calendar, of the Islamic calendar, and the first 10 days are the apex of Shia rituality, is when the Shias reenact and commemorate the Battle of Karbala, which is the moment in which Imam Hussein is martyred, is killed by those who would be defined as Sunnis, and that's an extremely important moment. Shias all over the world gather to retell the stories of over each night, you would recite the story of the battle for that day. And on the 10th of Muharram, you would have very large gatherings of Shias commemorating communally. And when I started this project in 2009, I've never encountered any sort of tensions, opposition, discomfort from, I used to live with a Sunni family and nobody in the compound ever thought that that was weird or there was anything off about it. Just last week, the main Ashura event in Bandung, which is one of the headquarters of Shia or Alid Piety in Java, the main event had its location changed at least 4 times before the event took place, with the last change taking place just 2 hours before the event was due to start. And that was because every time they set a new location, there would be pickets of anti-Shia groups standing outside and threatening or preventing people from getting into the stadium or the school or the conference room or whatnot. And even through these attempts at precaution, eventually all the participants had to be escorted to their respective homes by police. I think that the city deployed about 1,000 policemen to bring people home. So this idea of a construction of sectarianism, though, I've been portraying it as Sunnis radicalizing and becoming more conscious of their Sunniness, if you will, versus an emerging Shia-ness in Indonesia specifically. But this applies also, is very relative to Malaysia. We have to look at the flip side of the coin. This sectarian construction happens also within the Shia community. So that Alid Piety that I was mentioning earlier, this non-sectarian devotion for people who are important to the Shia tradition, which are most relevantly the Prophet Muhammad, his daughter Fatima, Fatima's husband Ali, who also happened to be Muhammad's cousin, very common in Arab culture to marry your cousin or to get married off to your father's cousin, and their 2 children, Hassan and Hussein. So these 5 are called the people of the house, and they are objects, receivers of very strong devotion. So this non-sectarian devotion for the people of the house is rapidly dissipating and disappearing as most people who are part of this congregation, part of this group, feel that their religious identity is being threatened and they have to become clearer about what their religious identity is. And in this, Iran is playing an extremely important role in redefining the rituality and redefining the religious identities in a more programmatically Shia way. What the book attempts to do is really to find this niche into understanding or offering a different interpretative analysis of what Shia Islam is vis-a-vis Sunni, and trying to pretend that this dichotomy doesn't exist, or start analyzing things when that dichotomy did not exist, and look at how it came about. The book structure, and I hope I might have to borrow a copy of the book. But the book is really structured in 4 main sections to really highlight this transition and how sectarian identities came to be formed. So we start with a history section, and I also, one thing that I wanted to add, I'm very pleased to say I've read this book several times, as we had to go through multiple versions of it and multiple proofs. I still find quite fascinating how each chapter really speaks to the other chapters. Is one of these, and I'm not usually a particularly proud editor, but I feel really good at saying that there is a constant thread throughout the volume. This engagement with the idea of Alid Piety and the engagement with, can we really talk about Shia Islam? Yes or no? Why? And having this conversation departing from the introduction, which is not really an introduction, it's a substantial chapter, and through the evolution, through the various sections. So the first section looks at the historical foundations, with 2 very important chapters. One on Iran, so looking at the center of where these devotional forms started, but again, not looking at necessarily contemporary Iran, but Iran before 1979, which is very important, meaning devotion that was not being influenced by the Islamic Republic, but devotion that took shape at a more grassroots level rather than from a top-down mechanism. And the second chapter on Thailand. Thailand is often off the map of Islamic studies and Islamic studies in Southeast Asia as well. But going back several centuries, going back probably as early as the 7th and 8th century, so the very beginnings of Islam, we can find Persian traders being present in Ayutthaya, the early kingdom. And through the centuries, we keep having a presence of Persian and more generally, which, mind you, when we say Persian, it doesn't mean that they were Muslims, and far less it meant that they were Shia. So Iran, what today we call Iran, became Shia only in the 16th century. And much of the Persian early traders were Nestorian or Eastern Christians. But so this trading connection was very strong from the very beginning, which meant many Muslims were arriving into Ayutthaya. And there are, up to today, many narratives that are being passed on from generation to generation of Shias or devotees of the Ahlul Bayt, devotees of the people of the house, which trace back the roots to the early waves of Shia immigrants. And this gives me the opportunity to talk about 2 more, I think, very important things, which are one of these self-narratives. So in the introduction, Bona referred to manuscripts, and that's one part of the story. But Southeast Asia is not a friendly environment to manuscripts. So much of the sources that we have to work with are manuscripts and family stories, traditions that are being passed on, and sometimes traditions that have been made up to explain things. But it's the beauty of understanding things in their own context. And so much of what we deal with here is self-narration, so recasting of the past, and trying to understand why today some people are practicing devotion towards the people of the house, even though their parents did not, or their parents were not Shiite, and trying to come to terms with this apparent disconnection between what one learns from the books and what one is told about this dichotomy between Sunni and Shia Islam, and the lived experience of religious practices. So we look at Persia as the fulcrum and the center of devotional practice, and Thailand as the periphery of the periphery, when we talk about in terms of Islamic studies, of course. The second part is extremely important. It focuses on the literary legacies, and it shows how in manuscripts that are very much from the 18th century, meaning that the copies that the authors had are from the 18th century, but probably they were much older than that, show indication of a proclivity towards Shia Islam, or showed forms of Alid Piety. I'm repeating myself here, but I need to keep this double layer. This section is a section we got in trouble with our first publisher, which is not the current publisher, because much of this literature actually looks at Ali and Fatima, so the daughter, Muhammad's daughter, and her husband, as the prototypical couple, the perfect couple within Islam. This means that Fatima is the perfect wife, even though their marriage was extremely unhappy. Fatima really did not love Ali, and Ali wanted to take a second wife, and Muhammad decides that he should not. So they're not the happiest of couples, and yet they are the perfect couple because they are the descendants of Muhammad, and they give their offspring is what allows for the genealogical line to survive in the centuries to come. But besides their marital relationship, of course, there is the issue of offspring, which of course comes through sexual intercourse. And there are a number of manuscripts that are in quite some detail analyzed in the book that look at what practices can you advance while you're having intercourse to have the hoped for offspring. So say if your wife Fatima gets pregnant on a Monday, for example, she will have a son that will be lazy in his religious devotion. But if you impregnate your wife on at the beginning or at the end of the month, they will also have negative consequences. And so it goes into great details about how to go about to have the perfect offspring. And it's quite fascinating that we see manuscripts of this sort emerging in Java, as well as in Aceh and South Sulawesi, and in Sunda, sorry. So within Java, both in the Sundanese language and in the Javanese language. So some of these are translations or inspired by Arabic and Persian texts, and others are extremely vernacular, where you can see direct references to drinking arak, for example, or doing things that are, let's say, having cultural references that are specifically Southeast Asians and definitely not Middle Eastern. And so in this section, we can see the ways in which Ali and Fatima have been deployed in literature as the perfect couple for an audience that was clearly non-Shiite. The third section of the book is titled Modalities of Alid Piety and Cultural Expressions in the Modern Period. So here we jump into very much into the 20th century, and there is much focus dedicated to the descendants of the Prophet. So the Ba'alawis, for example, as a clan of Arab descent who settled in Southeast Asia through the 16th century, and how their connection to Muhammad becomes a way to have a broader pattern of devotion towards the family of the Prophet, towards the people of the house. And it's also in this section that we have 3 contributions that look at Muharram commemorations and different forms of Muharram commemorations in Sumatra, so in Bengkulu, that is somewhere here in Western Sumatra, in Penang, that is here, so colonial Penang, and one in Kuala Lumpur. And the last section, part 4, is titled Contemporary Developments, and really looks at how we got from Alid Piety and in what status Alid Piety is today, and how that relates to a more programmatic approach to Shia Islam. So I think I will leave it at this for my half an hour, and thank you for listening.
Plenty of time for questions. I will be running around with the microphone so the questions will be picked up.
Hi, thank you for that. That was excellent. I'm curious about the transposition of devotional figures from the Middle East. You were talking about the adding of sort of local culture into the sort of stories, the devotional stories. And I'm wondering if is there a range of those? Is that one of the reasons why the Alid Piety is a looser group, is because it's nativized, and how does that work?
Thank you, that's actually a great question. I had prepared a quote from that, from the book. First, the more maybe theoretical and abstract aspect. I think that we were talking about this in class, actually just an hour ago. The process of vernacularization is extremely interesting, and I think that, yes, to a certain extent, the people of the house are easier to fit within this local cultural paradigm versus Muhammad himself, because Muhammad's life story is canonized, and of course his historical and prophetical role is very deeply set into what it is. Whereas the rest of the family around him, we do have hagiographical stories that are based on some fragments of history, but often much of it is based on legend, is based on hearsay, or we have multiple versions thereof. So in the South Asian context, for example, there are some characters of the family of the Prophet that are more prominent than others. So there are some stories within the Muharram narratives that have become more popular because they reflect local practices. So one of the things that we were reading about is the story of the marriage between one of the sons of Hussein and another family member of the extended family. They are cousins. They get married right before the groom goes off to battle, and everybody knows that he's going to die. But they get married so that he has accomplished his duty to get married, and she saves the honor of the family by being married to her cousin. But this is a story that in Middle Eastern narratives you often don't find. But it becomes extremely interesting on a South Asian context because of the importance of, or let's say the narrative and the discourse around widowhood. And so that becomes a story that women in South Asia can relate themselves to. But so going specifically to Southeast Asia, I just want to quote a paragraph from Mulai Kahij's contribution on the Malay text. The Malay text on Fatima as the prototype and the perfect woman. So these are not made to represent. She is not made to represent only Sunni and Shias, but also Sufi and older values. Fatima in the Malay manuscript tradition is also capable of representing a range of older non-Islamic female religious figures. So in some texts, she amalgamates Sufi and shamanic elements within the figure of Fatima. In others, she is associated with tantric practices. In yet other texts, we see them including some aspects of Shia hagiography and Sunni traditions, or at once. And eventually you have some text that makes indigenous mores with a basic Islamic orthopraxy. And so this is all over the map, really. You have all these different manifestations, but one of the interesting points that the Mulai Kahij makes and Wani Mukherjee also makes is it is the Southeast Asian context that, for example, allows for Fatima and other women to come across as very strong characters, whereas in the equivalent texts in the South Asia or Middle Eastern traditions, they wouldn't necessarily be so charismatic and so powerful. So there is definitely a very strong influence from the local context, which, however, should never stretch its boundaries too much because you still want them to be recognized as the canonical figures of the Islamic tradition. So it's an interesting conversation that goes on there, yeah.
So I'm really interested in this moment that you had when you were sitting in this house and you saw something that was kind of off, and you made that distinction that something doesn't seem right, and that was kind of the beginning moment of this entire research kind of endeavor. And I'm wondering if there were other moments like that or other symbols within houses or things outside of just devotional practices that drew you to this topic.
Yes, that was one of those lamp, lighting of the map of the lamp moment. I'm just saying, is this just me, or there is actually something there? And that's the moment in which you go and talk to someone who should know more about it than you, and say, no, actually, that's great. There is more to it than just a picture on the wall. But there were a number. I was living in Indonesia that year. Actually, I lived there for 2 years, and so occasionally I would stumble across little pieces of the puzzle. But the other moment that I had, which was revelatory, not necessarily in a good way, was when I traveled to Bengkulu, so this town here in Western Sumatra, and I was there for Muharram. And it was a friend/informant who was studying in Jogja who invited me to go because her father had been in charge of the Shia community for a very long time. So she herself has studied in Tehran for a little while. Her sister is in Qom now. She got married to another Indonesian who was studying in Qom. So they're very much within that path, but the Iranian directed path. But their father was coordinating the traditional devotional practices. And one of those revelatory moments was being invited there, showing up, and realizing that the pièce de résistance of the evening performance was an Iranian troupe that had been shipped off to really the middle of nowhere in Sumatra by the Iranian embassy with the support of some local NGOs to show the local populations what the real Shias do during Muharram. They don't do drumming competitions. They don't do stage fake battles with fish of papier-mâché, but they reenact the Battle of Karbala with only men on stage, also performing the female characters, only accompanied by a trumpet and a flute, and it's all in Farsi. So nobody understands a word of what's going on stage, but everybody supposedly should understand the theatrical encounter. And so that was another really important moment, which we should relatively be glad that the publishing had been delayed, because we were able to include this idea of sectarian construction through as a thread, at least in the first chapter, and important moment. Not necessarily a happy one, because I think that is creating problems on the grounds, but definitely academically and research-wise was great. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. I'm curious, what does this whole quote-unquote dichotomy that you try to resolve tell us now?
Can you say that again? Sorry.
What is the quote-unquote dichotomy that you started your talk with and then you try to resolve?
The Sunni Shia.
Not the Sunni Shia, the Alid Piety versus Shi'ism.
Yeah. So when we talk about...
Yeah, let me finish, please.
Oh, sorry, I thought that was...
It's okay. So what does it tell us in today's history? Maybe it's not history yet, but it will be history at some point, specifically when it develops into quote-unquote political affairs. But the other question that I noticed you mentioned, the beginning of the piety experience in modern times, or actually even before modern times, is in Iran. And you did mention the Battle of Karbala. So actually this piety, theatrical things, started in Iraq, in Najaf and Karbala, right? So how do you relate these two locations between Iraq and Iran?
I'll
That's
start from the
question.
second question and then go to the first one. Thank you. So yes, Karbala is not too far from Kufa in contemporary Iraq, but actually the practice of reenacting Karbala, so that important devotional and theatrical moment, really resides in the Persian Iranian tradition. So the tazia, the passion play, it's a purely Persian tradition, for example. But the other connection is, when we talk about Iran and Iraq, of course, we're talking about post-colonial, recent boundary making. So I guess referring to Persia, I am referring to a broader cultural sphere. But I'm still pretty convinced, and I'm not going to argue for the contributor, but I'm still pretty convinced of arguing that the devotional practices related to Karbala did not start in Karbala. In fact, they are they pertain more to the Iranian sphere, the Persian sphere. And that's because Iraq was still the stronghold of the Umayyad dynasty. And the Umayyads are those who did actually martyr Hussein. And so within the space, geographical space, there wasn't any ritualistic space for the commemoration of Imam Hussein. It's something that happened more on the outside that core. And of course, Iran was still far from being, or Persia was still far from being Shiite, because we're talking about an 7th century event and a 16th century transformation. But I do think that it belonged more to the peripheries than to the core of contemporary Iraq. And the other aspect, the more modern aspect to that, is really that it is Iran since, and I mean Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, since 1979, that has been promoting not the revolution, as most of the Southeast Asian states were actually concerned about in the early 80s. They were not promoting the revolution, but they have been promoting a form of devotion that fits within a very specific paradigm that is not even Iranian, but it is the paradigm of the Islamic Republic. So that's if we are shifting to contemporary times. Going back to the dichotomy between Alid Piety and Shia Islam, as I was mentioning in the beginning, to be correct, when we talk about Shia Islam or we define someone as a Shia, a Muslim, we are assuming that we're labeling that person as a follower of the Jafari fiqh, of Jafari school of law, which came about in the 9th century following the 6th Imam of Shia Islam. So that's an extremely narrow understanding of who is a Shiite, but it's a legalistic definition. The label of Alid Piety, which we did not come up with, as I was mentioning, is something that comes from Marshall Hodgson, a breakthrough article that was published in 1955. It's amazing to think how early it was published, in which he argues that before Imam Jafar Sadiq, there was a time in which devotion happened towards the members of the family of the Prophet. And people were not Sunni or Shiite because that dichotomy did not exist. And so it's a pre-sectarian approach to Alid devotion, which he defines and we borrow as Alid piety or Alid loyalty. It is this gray zone that then becomes channeled either into Shia, programmatically Shia devotion, following certain specific patterns, including visits to the shrines that would be in Iraq, for example, or Sufistic Sunni approaches. So Egypt is most interesting for this, the idea a Mohammedan light is extremely crucial to the shaping of Sufism in Egypt, and that really refers to this biological descent connection in which Fatima and Ali are crucial, are key to. So this is the distinction, is Shi'ism as a programmatic, legalistic label, and Alid Piety as a devotional, broader label in which someone who practices Maliki law could be practicing and is likely to be practicing some forms of Alid Piety, meaning might be going to some shrines, might be uttering certain prayers, might be commemorating the killing of Hussein as a defender of justice versus Muawiyah and Yazid that instead are seen as aggressive. So there are these shades and nuances that I think are often lost when we think about Shia versus Sunni, where there is no conversation. And instead I'm going to say in 2009, I was extremely convinced that that conversation had been going on and was still going on in Indonesia and in some parts of Malaysia and other parts of Southeast Asia. Today, I need to acknowledge the fact that is an extremely useful, I think we need to acknowledge is an extremely useful analytical tool to look at the past and to think about how things have been changing in the past 5 or 6 years, because the landscape has been changing so fast that it's important to acknowledge that it hasn't been always like this. And yes, I hope that answered two very good questions.
I guess just 2 things. The first one, just to comment off of that, I have read a lot of literature stating the school, like the Maliki school, actually came from Jafri, just because he was kind of a teacher for all Muslims around the area. So the emergence of the school of Maliki came through Jafri, from what I'm understanding. So it would be interesting to look into that furthermore. And then the second thing was, I guess according to what I read as well, I've heard that Fatima kind of inherited her qualities from her mom, who was Khadija, and she was known for being kind of one of the wealthiest women in the Arab lands at that time, and not just wealthy, but as well as giving, because she would set up a lot of orphanages for, you know, girls and kids around the area. So I was wondering, in Indonesia, are there more scripts about like Fatima, her characteristics as a woman, or just like her leadership skills or her leadership qualities? Because I know her daughter Zainab, who also went against Yazid's army, also technically inherited those characteristics from her mom, who was Fatima.
Those are 2 great comments. Regarding the fiqh aspect, the legalistic aspect, Jafar Sadiq himself, he was an extremely prominent legal scholar of his time. His Quranic commentary was used by Sunnis and Shias alike. There wasn't that distinction at the time. I'm not as familiar with the Maliki school as much as I am with the Shafi school, for example, and there are some of the poems written by Al-Shafi that are very clear on the importance of devotion towards Muhammad and his progeny. So the Ba'alawi, who had just in passing mentioned earlier as an Arab clan that then part of which migrated to Southeast Asia in the 16th century, they have a very strong, they're Shafi, they're just Sunni. Most of them are extremely anti-Shia, and yet when it is the birthday of the Prophet, they have major devotional meetings and prayer sessions. And it's not just Muhammad, of course, because he's not in a vacuum. He has his progeny, and they see themselves as his progeny. And so there is much overlap in that devotional aspect, but there isn't as much in the legalistic aspect. But yeah, that's a very important point. And Fatima, I mean, again, we had a class on Fatima today. It's fascinating how differently she's portrayed in different contexts. But usually the literature that explores her always goes back to her as the daughter of Muhammad. It doesn't go back to her as the daughter of Khadija, even, well, of course, she was, but that's not her, her claim to fame. Khadija herself is extremely famous and extremely well spoken of, because of her wealth, but wealth that is not that she inherited, that she earned herself as being an extremely skillful businesswoman. And that's how she gets to know Muhammad, because Muhammad used to work for her. And she's impressed with him, and they decide to get married. But so it's very interesting how Fatima, and then, well, let's take it one step at a time, how Fatima is mostly thought about as the daughter of Muhammad, which brings us to the fact that often Ali, it's taught and talked about as the husband of Fatima. I mean, that's what makes him so important. Yes, of course, he's Muhammad's cousin. So there is a line of descent that they had, their fathers were brothers. But really, he is so important because he fertilized the eggs that were the descendants of Prophet Muhammad. So there is that connection there that Fatima is, without Fatima, you wouldn't have that. And going to Zainab, she is seen as, of course, the daughter of both, and being so important as the sister of Hussein. She's incredibly relevant during the Karbala events. But also she's important because she's seen as the repository of memory, of the memory of Muharram. And so her claim to fame is being the one who was destined to remind the entire Muslim population that Karbala happened, and that Yazid was on the wrong side, and that Hussein, as the descendant of the Prophet, got killed. But so we were, it's interesting to think about what are the genealogical connections that are made to matter. And sometimes it's the woman, and sometimes it's the man, sometimes it's the father, sometimes it's the mother. But that's extremely interesting to explore. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I came in 10 minutes late, so to really address this, I apologize. I'm curious about the process of sectarianization, and it's wow, it's amazing that you said that at the end that actually Iran has people there to sort of spread more sort of maybe orthodox ways of practicing it. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the broader sort of Middle Eastern actors who are on the spot. So, for instance, on the Sunni side, are there also sort of Middle Eastern actors coming? So we know that there's a long history of Southeast Asians going to Middle East to get educated and come back. So in your story, those people are there. But maybe what's new is, wow, now we have Middle Eastern, and they're really tied into the state, and it's, yeah. Could you just talk a bit more about that?
So the phenomenon that usually we are more familiar with is post-oil crisis, oil boom, 1970s, Saudi Arabia sending scholars out of Saudi Arabia through the furthest lands of Islam to establish mosques or fund mosques that already existed on exchange of having their own appointed imams, right, mosque leaders. And that was one way in which one specific brand of Sunni Islam, Wahhabism, became widespread throughout Southeast Asia, but also, of course, other areas across Asia and the Middle East. What I think is quite fair to say is that Iran is following up on that 30 years later, but that's the same pattern. Both giving scholarships for students to come to Iran, as students have been going to Saudi Arabia, to Medina specifically for decades, but also to go to Southeast Asia. So for example, in Bangkok, there are a couple of very important centers. One is the embassy, the Iranian embassy, and the other one is the Hoi Foundation. So that's, I mean, without getting too much into Iranian politics, that's extremely interesting because Al-Hoi was a teacher of Khomeini, but he was also the one who was against the rulership of the clerics. So he did not see eye to eye with Khomeini. But so that's, you have two actors there, both from Iran, with very different visions. In Malaysia, because of the government's strong stand for a Malay Shafi'i brand of Sunni Islam, you don't see any, as far as I'm aware, you don't see any Iranian presence. I've often come across it in Indonesia, come across Malaysians who had come to Indonesia specifically to commemorate Muharram so that they could do it in communion and in public without fears of a government police raid, for example. But Indonesia, since the end of the Suharto regime, has been very much a free-for-all playing field. And it's the same with Cambodia. We have a graduate student here in the anthropology department, Amiko Stock, who works on that in Cambodia. You have, since the end of the regime, you have all these missionaries, all these da'is going, and they might be Shia, they might be Sunni, they might be Tablighis, they might be anything. But freedom brings that, right? Democracy brings that as well. So Iran is extremely present, but you also don't expect that they are there with their big flags and being loud about it. It's a very subtle process, but it's present. And the number of scholarships grows exponentially every year. And it used to be only religious training, and now you can get a scholarship to go and study medicine in Tehran. In theory, it has nothing religious about it, but you can argue that it might be second thought.
The tensions of the sectarianism, where is it coming from? Is it coming from local actors, or is it, who is doing the policing, right? Like,
that's a very big question, and it depends. I think it's extremely localized. So again, hoping that we're not boring you, I will still refer to Indonesia. There has been an escalation of sectarian encounters starting in 2005. And that's, my analysis of this is very much grounded in the shift in power between government and previously government-funded religious organizations. So what is in English? The MUI, the Indonesian Muslim Council, the equivalent of MUIs in Singapore, used to be absolutely under the thumb of Suharto during the dictatorship. But after 1998, you have a sort of a disconnection there. And so the government is not co-opting the Islamic intelligentsia anymore, and MUI becomes increasingly independent. After a few years that they didn't know what to do with themselves, they realized that with a relatively weak state, in terms of religions, they could start being louder. And so they're extremely orthodox in a Malaysian way. So Sunni, Shafi'i brand of Islam, and they started with the anti-Ahmadiyya propaganda that then fed into anti-Shia propaganda. So you can really see the escalation, and it's been the para-governmental, semi-governmental institutions that are opening these windows and these spaces with the collusion of the police, and as usually happens when you have thugs violence. Yeah.
Do we have one more question? If not, join me in thanking Professor Formichi for the interesting